Welcome to the Wine Nirvana podcast. Wine reviews for the average wine drinker. No pretense, no snobbery, no numerical ratings. And here's our host, Stephen Hawk.
Thank you, Robin. And listener, thank you for joining me for the Wine Nirvana podcast. Our guest today is Jim Laughren. Jim is a certified wine educator, a member of the Society of Wine Educators, and the award-winning author of 50 Ways to Love Wine More, and a beer drinker's guide to knowing and enjoying fine wine. We'll be talking about those books a little later. He's known for his irreverent approach and abiding enthusiasm for all things fermented. He is founder of the Chicago-based WineHead Consulting and a former importer and distributor of fine wines from around the world. Jim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Stephen, my pleasure. Happy to be with you.
Great. So let's begin with, how did you get started in the wine world?
Oh, boy. Let's see. How did I get started? Well, I was one of those people who, even as a youngster, perhaps I should say as a teenager, found that I enjoyed wine, whereas my contemporaries were mostly sloshing in the beer, which I like as well, of course. I really kind of had a special place in my heart for wine. And even back in the day in college, I would, invite a bunch of people over for dinner, and I'd pull out not a 6-pack of something, but I would pull out a jug of something Californian back in those days that was probably called Hardy Burgundy or something like that.
Oh, I bet it was.
It was. And I mean, I also will bet it didn't contain a single drop of Pinot Noir.
I bet you're also right.
Yes, but it was the grapes that got me. From that point, have been a fan of wine on various levels, and later in life began paying much more attention and collecting, as in maybe buying more than one bottle at a time. And that progressed, and obviously I got very much into it, and then met a fellow at a wine tasting a number of years ago, a doctor who owned a import and distribution company. But he was typical of doctors. He was a great doctor, but didn't really know much about business, even though he wanted to. And so he asked me to come in and essentially run his company, which I did. And that was the moment of switching from the avocation to the vocation of wine. And it was a wonderful move at the time for me. Exposed me to just a much bigger world of wine, and have never looked back.
So what exactly is a certified wine educator?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, what type of training is involved? I assume there's lots of drinking wine.
Yes, it's one of those brutal things where you have to drink wine for a number of years before you
Yes.
Well, the big designations in the wine world, at the top of the pinnacle, I think we can all agree, is probably the Master of Wine, the MW program, which was begun in England and is still based there. Then we also have the Master Sommelier designation, which is really a great program as well, and appropriate if you want to be a sommelier. In other words, you want to work in a restaurant and manage their wine list and be on the floor and talk to customers about pairing food and wine, which is essentially the definition of a sommelier. That's great. And then there is a CWE, or Certified Wine Educator, which is focused more, as it sounds, at disseminating knowledge to people in all walks of life. Some CWEs end up working in the industry. let's say, as a director of education for a distributor, or teaching wine and hospitality at a school that has a program, a cooking school, or a school that has a program in hospitality, or they're just very serious amateurs who just love wine and want to know more about it. So it covers a lot of sins, actually, but it's a great group of people. It's a great organization. And it's a pretty extensive exam. I mean, it's not an easy thing to pass. There, of all of these polynomials, I guess we call them, there are only few hundred in the world. So there is some element of difficulty in becoming a certified wine educator. You obviously have to know about wine. You have both a written test and a multiple choice and essay questions and a tasting blind tasting test as well. So it's a lot of fun, and it's a program that I highly recommend to anyone who's into wine. For some people who may not be quite as advanced and ready for that option, there's a starter program with all of these things. If you're going Master of Wine route, you begin with a WSET, or Wine and Spirits Education Trust programs, and you can get levels 1 through 4 basically. Or you can go to the Court of Master Sommeliers, and you can start as I'm not sure, they have 2 or 3 kind of beginning levels, and then you become a certified sommelier and then eventually a master sommelier. And with the Society of Wine Educators, a great education for someone who would like to know more is becoming a certified wine specialist. That's kind of their entry level degree, if you will. And a lot of fun, a lot of great people involved in it. So I highly recommend it.
With all those aspects, what is the favorite part of what you do?
Probably drinking wine. I hate to be so superficial, but I love teaching about wine. I love introducing people to flavors and to concepts regarding wine that they've never really experienced before, or that they've never thought about. Wine is such an overarching subject in that it has been an integral part of humanity, of the human race, of the human condition for thousands of years. I mean, at least uh, I don't know. No one knows where or when wine began, but it's conceivable that humans were imbibing in some sort of wine 20,000 years ago. And wine's earliest identifiable presence is in the country of Georgia, that absolutely delightful place in the South Caucasus region. There have been wine jars discovered there that contain wine residue that dates back 8,000 years. So, that's pretty stunning when you consider it. Now, 8,000 years ago, the wine industry, and I'll use that term, just bear with me, was advanced to the point where communities were making large, elaborate, decorated clay pots, and they were jointly making big batches of wine to share in the community. That we know. And this was 2,500 years before the advent of writing. So there's a tremendous lineage. Not every, but many of the world's greatest religions, or major religions, or religions period, incorporate wine into their theology in some way, shape, or form. Wine was one of the main 2 or 3 medicines for almost all of human existence, probably up until the 1800s and the discovery of antibiotics. Wine and honey, and then various local plants really were the pharmacology of the human race. So when you look at that, when you look at the trade routes that it opened, when you look at the economic impact it had, when you consider such things that 3,000 years before Christ, BC, 3000 BC, the very first pharaoh of the United Kingdoms of Egypt, the very first, Scorpion the One, number one in that entire lineage was buried with jars and jars and jars of wines. And not only was he, or I should say entombed perhaps, but not only was he entombed with the wine, each one of these big amphora-like jugs was labeled as to the year it was made, what vineyard it came from, and who the winemaker was. So there's so much to learn. There's so much to me that's rather awe-inspiring when you really get into wine. I just love sharing that aspect of it, that unknown element of it, that beyond the chemistry element of it.
Yes, this really does speak to how closely intertwined the history of wine and humanity is. And like you say, that it just goes back really just about to the beginning. So, how do you continue to learn and improve?
Well, I think there are three main approaches that I take. One is that I read a lot. I read wine books, I read news stories, I read industry information. I just stay up something of great interest to me, so I'm always reading about it. And in terms of reading books, there are books if you can search and seek and have some good direction. There are books that really focus on every aspect almost of wine. So there's always some part of it that you've never really considered. But if you want to, there is material for you. The second approach I take is I drink a lot. So that just comes with the territory. I'm sorry to break this to you, Stephen, but if you want, you're just going to have to get yourself a good set of stemware and go for it.
Yeah, as a wine blogger, I am burdened with the same onerous tasks.
There you go.
Indeed.
It is tough. Yeah. But the key, I think, also is to explore as you taste. So look for the new varietal that you've never tried before. Look for a varietal that you didn't know was made in a particular region. Look for something different. Keep in mind that there are probably 10,000 varieties of grapes in the world, and wine is probably made from about 1,000 of them. A country like Italy may produce as many as 800 different wines itself. So there is plenty of wine to be tried that we haven't tried. There are many varieties out there that we've never heard of because they're made in some small region in southern Campania in a hidden valley, and that's the only place this grape has been cultivated for the past 3,000 years. There's a lot of that in the world. So find out about it, learn about these little places, try these wines. There's a magnificent array of flavors in the bottle of wine. I've been drinking wine for decades, and yet occasionally I'll open a bottle and it's like, I've never had this. This is marvelous. This has this characteristic and that characteristic, and it's truly wonderful, but I don't recognize this at all. I wouldn't even begin to know what to do with this in a blind tasting. It's just strange. It's foreign. And when you can have that kind of reaction and then learn about that wine, learn where it comes from, learn about the grape, learn a little bit about the cultural milieu that produced this wine, it's wonderful. It's educational. Those are the first two. Then the third way that I like to stay current or stay up, one that unfortunately we haven't been able to do nearly as much of lately, is to travel. There are always wine regions, unless you're some very wealthy person or you're funded by some very wealthy company. There are always wine regions you haven't visited. And it's so exciting to go to a region and to go to the place where this storied wine that you've always heard of is actually produced, and to try it in the winery, and to bring some home if you want, or to ship some home if you can, or just to enjoy it if you can't. It doesn't matter where. I've been lucky enough to be in a lot of wine regions, but I've also not yet visited a lot of wine regions. I've yet to hit New Zealand or Australia. They make a lot of wine in India, and they're actually beginning to make pretty good wine in India. Well, I've never been to India. I've never been to the wine regions in India. I've yet to get to South Africa, a place that I really would love to go visit, that has a fabulous wine culture. So there's always more to learn. There's always somewhere new to go. There's always a type of wine to try that you've never tried. And by doing this, by pushing the edge of your own envelope all the time, you can really stay alive and interested and acquire knowledge that's enjoyable for me, at least, to pass on to other people.
Not long ago, the question occurred to me, how many wines are there in the world? So I Googled that, like we all do. And of course, nobody really knows. But the best guess was between 100,000 and 250,000 different wines. Well, nobody's going to even put any kind of a dent in that in a dozen lifetimes. So it just shows that the wine world is huge, and there's just a whole lot to explore.
Well, that's one of the things I think that keeps it interesting too. I mean, personally, I always like to be in a field where I don't know everything, because in anything, whether it's an interest or a job or a hobby or whatever it may be, when you start reaching that point where you know most of it, maybe 85% of everything there is to know about, I don't know, mounting insect collections or something. When you reach that point, to me, I begin to lose interest. All right, I know most everything about this. Boom, let's move on to the next thing. It doesn't hold my interest after I've learned it. But with wine, you can never reach that point. It's just impossible. It doesn't matter who you are. You'll never reach the point where you can honestly say to yourself, gee, I think I know most everything there is to know about this.
I think that's exactly right. As you well know, there's a great deal of snobbery in the wine world. But Wine Nirvana is focused on the casual and the curious wine drinker. So what are a few things you might suggest to my audience so they don't feel intimidated?
Snobbery, you say? Well, I would instruct them in the fine art of holding a wine stem with their pinky extended, don't you know? I think that the snobbery aspect is a really crazy and unfortunate and very recent element of the wine world. We take things much too seriously in this society, generally speaking, and it becomes a competition. One ups personship, if you will. I know a fragment of information that you don't, so therefore I'm cooler than you are, or something along those lines. For people who feel or who want to not get involved in that, the first thing is, remember, it's just fermented grape juice. Right? We're not talking about making heat shields out of rare earths and metals. It's fermented grape juice, folks. Anybody can make it. It doesn't take anything to make wine. It may not be the finest wine you've ever tasted, but if you can get a bunch of grapes and stick them in a bucket and break the skins on a few of them and then leave it alone for a couple of weeks, you're going to have wine. I mean, that's all that it takes. That's all that it is. Don't worry, number one, about the subject itself. And number two, when it comes to taste and flavor, and this is where the snobbery will sometimes shoot its arrows at you, saying, oh, well, this tastes of whatever, yada, yada. This is a wonderful wine. Lovely aromas of raspberry and strawberry, tart and baking spices and yada, yada. And if you don't smell that stuff, don't worry about it. If you don't taste that stuff, don't worry about it, because the only palate that matters when you're drinking wine is your own, because you are the one experiencing it. I mean, we can go to ridiculous extremes, which usually isn't the case. I mean, some critic may absolutely love a bottle of wine and declare it to be the greatest thing in the world, and you may absolutely hate it. Now, it's usually not quite that extreme, but don't worry about what other people think you should enjoy, either with food or on its own. It's your palate, it's your life. Do you eat peas because the food critics say peas are wonderful for you? Or do you not eat peas because you don't like them, or you eat them because you do like them. Fruits and vegetables and foods, you eat what you like. You don't think about what other people say about them. If you go to the grocery store, you're not worried if someone else likes mandarin oranges as you're picking up some mandarin oranges. Try to adopt a similar attitude with wine. You're going and you're exploring and looking for a new variety to please yourself, not to please anybody else. And just realize that those people often have an agenda that you don't have as a consumer. Your agenda is just to make your mouth feel good, to make your mouth happy. A critic has an agenda in that they have to write whatever, an article for a wine magazine once a month, or they have to send out their newsletter weekly or something like that. So they have to talk about stuff because that's how they get paid. That's how they make their living. You don't. They'll babble and say anything just to fill up space, just to create copy or to take up time. Just enjoy wine. Wine is meant to give pleasure. That's one of its greatest gifts, if you will, to humanity, was giving pleasure, was making people feel a little more relaxed, a little less sensitive to the environment. If this was someone drinking wine back in the latter days of the ice ages and life was miserable and they were always cold and hungry frequently and things were tough, and someone in your group or clan or tribe or whatever it was had discovered wine or discovered how to make some wine, and you took a few swallows of that, and it was a balm, BALM, to your soul, to your existence. That's wine's greatest calling, is to bring you pleasure, and just accept it on those terms.
Well, I could not agree more. And my mantra is drink what you like. And I tell that to people all the time. I am not a fan of sweet wines, but if somebody is, then that's what they should do. Like you say, whatever makes you happy, whatever gives you pleasure. So since I mentioned that there are hundreds of thousands of wines out there, when people are facing hundreds of choices in a wine shop or even a grocery store, what tips can you give them to help guide their decision making?
Well, I think until you gain a certain level of experience, which will in and of itself breed growing confidence, I think one of your best friends can be a really good wine retailer. If you find the woman or the man who runs the local wine shop, get to know them, pick their brain. Remember, their only objective is to make you happy so that you'll come back and buy another bottle. Their objective isn't to be snotty with you, because there's no upside to them in treating you that way. Go into a wine shop, and when you see the clerk, ask her, for instance, let's make it very simple. Oh, I've been drinking Merlot all my life, and I like Merlot, but I'd like to try something a little different, yet something similar. Or I've been drinking Pinot Grigio, or I've been drinking Pinot Noir, whatever it may be. Just say, I'm familiar with the taste of this kind of grape, and I'd like to try something. And I like that. I like the feel of it in my mouth. I like the taste of it. I like the fruitiness of it. Can you recommend something that might be similar, or something I can try, knowing what my preferences are? And they will almost always be able to direct you to something very interesting. And tell them you want something interesting. Say, look, I don't want to drink another bottle of the same old. I'm looking to expand my palate a little bit. And here's my price range. They have a lot of knowledge. A good wine merchant will taste every single bottle in her store before you ever show up. And they tend to have a lot of other wine knowledge as well. It's important to make use of that. Just pick their brains. Let them find it for you. And then if you do like it, go back and tell that same person. Establish a relationship. Gee, that was a really great recommendation. I don't know if you remember me. I mentioned that I, drink a lot of Merlot, and I like Merlot, and you directed me to this Mencia from Spain, and I think it was just marvelous. Da 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 da. And so, where do we go from here? Or go back and say, well, you recommended this Mencia from Spain, and I hated it. It was just too this and that compared to the Merlot I'm used to. So then you can have an expert on your side. You can have an expert at your fingertips, if you will. And these people are usually very happy to spend some time to talk with you, to share with you. And I really think that a good wine merchant can be a great asset.
I have a blog post titled "How to Become More Knowledgeable About Wine," and, and you could have co-authored it.
All right, there we go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
pretty funny.
yeah.
So how about some tips on selecting wines for a dinner party or maybe even a backyard barbecue?
Oh, okay. I now for me the key here is diversity, abundance. Let's get a little of everything going in here. If it's a backyard barbecue, especially, or a dinner party, okay, so you're going to have 6 or 8 or 10 or 25 of your closest friends over, and you're going to have a nice little soiree with some liquid refreshment to go along with the food. Well, even in a group of 6 or 8, you've got a lot of different palates there. You've got a lot of different tastes. You've got the potential for people who like a lot of different things. So again, I believe in the cornucopia approach to populating the table or the bar at least. So get a couple of really nice big reds. Now, obviously, you can shift a little bit depending on how well you do know these people and their tastes. But instead of letting it be about you, let it be about them. So just throw out everything and let people taste through it. Have a couple of big reds, have a couple of light reds, have a couple of interesting whites, have some beer, have some light beer and some heavier beer, have some IPAs and some stouts, whatever it may be. Just put out a whole bunch of stuff and have some bubbly, of course. It's always fun to start with bubbly, whatever you're going to drink after that. But I really think that it's just a matter that it's fun. And when people sit down and say, hey, look, today I've got 8 different wines here for you. I don't know what you're going to want, but run through them and let people pour for themselves. And I think that's a really fun and interesting way to approach it instead of saying, oh, well, if you're having barbecue, you've got to have Zinfandel. So the sweetness of the wine can offset the spice of the barbecue sauce. I mean, that may work for some people and may not work for other people.
Once again, drink what you like. When I'm on vacation, one of the things that I like to do is visit local wineries. And so, how can people make the most of a winery visit?
Well, this is a great question because there are local wineries almost everywhere in this country.
There are.
And they are of varying levels of quality, but that's the same with everything else, isn't it? I think, first of all, try everything of interest. Check before you go and see if they have any programs or entertainment or something like that. And if so, on which days. And I bring this up because, I mean, they have these programs in a lot of places, particularly in less prestigious appellations, where they will have a local band or a group or something come by on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. And there are tables outside. And I know they do this in Lodi. I know they do this in Ohio. I know they do this in a lot of places. It's a great afternoon. You get to meet other wine lovers. You go buy a bottle, sit at the table, drink your bottle of wine, or go through their tasting samples, listen to some good music, maybe have a burger or whatever. And that's just a fun way to experience it. Other than that, I would say when you visit a local winery, if they've got anything that's good that you enjoy, buy a bottle or two. Don't just go in for the visit, try 6 or 8 wines and say, boy, these 2 are really great, and then leave. These people are trying to make a living, and it's pretty skinny for them on their side of the ledger in most cases. So by buying a bottle or two, you're pumping money a little bit, but something back into the local economy, keeps the winery in business. And it's so cool to be back home and then share this, particularly with friends who are also into wines. Oh, well, when we were wherever we were, we went and visited this winery. So maybe you live in the Midwest somewhere and you go up to Door County and you come home and you've got wine drinking friends and you're, who knows, you're in the outskirts of St. Louis or Kansas City or I don't know, San Diego. Doesn't make much difference. And you say, God, this summer we went to Door County and the Cape Cod of the upper Midwest and some wineries there. And we picked up a case of wine from this one place. It's great stuff. Let's try it. Every wine drinker would love to be sitting in that room with you when you say that. Every one of us, because here's something new. And wine lovers are complete suckers for something new. Hey, I've got a bottle of this great stuff from somewhere that you've never tasted. Well, you're going to want to taste it then. So bring a couple bottles home, and it's just fun to drink wine when you've been to the winery. Even if you're buying, if I have been to some winery in France and we're having a bottle of French wine for dinner that night, it's just cool to remind us that we've been there and talk about the place. And you say, gee, I wonder how Pierre is doing, the winemaker. It was so cool when we were there. It just enriches your life. It really does. So participate at these wineries, pick up a bottle or two or more, whatever you want to do. Try what they have. If they make 8 different wines, don't just try one. Try 6 or 8 or as many as they'll let you try. And just look at it as a good time. It's just entertainment.
Yes, and it speaks to the, again, the sense of discovery in the world of wine, which is, it is. It's a lot of fun. What is often not so much fun, and in fact may be the most daunting thing for casual wine drinkers, and even for not so casual wine drinkers, is the restaurant wine list. It's a minefield of intimidation. So how can people approach the wine list fearlessly?
Well, yes, it is a monument to intimidation, isn't it? And the bigger the list is, the more so. But here again, I'm going to pass the buck to somebody else. If I'm sort of wine knowledgeable, but you put this 10-pound book in my hands and say, here, pick a wine, which can be a very difficult task, and to which the tricky thing is to which there is no right answer. That's it. We'd like to know what's right and what's wrong. People hate to make a mistake. There is no right answer here as to what's the wine to pick for the food you're eating. It's going to be very much based on your feelings and your palate and the company and any one of 24 wines probably. But pick the som's brain. If it's a restaurant that's serious enough to have a big wine list or an extensive wine list, then it's probably serious enough to have a wine steward or a sommelier working the floor. And every wine list has some bargains on it because the sommelier who is putting the list together either got a special deal from the distributor, or they've decided that this wine, though it's very good, just isn't selling very much. And so they want to get rid of it to make room for something that will sell better. So they discount it heavily. Any number of reasons could be behind the real deals on a wine list, but they are there. And I'm not afraid to just ask the somm. The waitress will say, do you want to order? I'd say, well, gee, do you have anyone who can tell me about the wine list? And sometimes she's it. Sometimes the server is the one. But occasionally or usually in a bigger place, there will be a sommelier. So have the sommelier come over and just lay it out. Say, look, here we are. We're a table of 4 and we're probably looking at having lamb chops and pasta and whatever, steak and whatever you're having. And I'd like your recommendations. I know that there are some great bargains on the list. Can you point them out to me? What are the great deals in wines that would go with these foods? And let them work. Why should you try to figure it out? I mean, there's nothing worse if you're a wine person. You go out with a bunch of people and they all hand you the list. So I'll be out with
Right.
friends, friends that I really want to talk with, friends I want to hang with. I'll be out with friends and they'll hand me the 25-page list. Well, what happens when you put 25-page wine list in my hands? I read it. I start going through it. I get engaged in it. And suddenly I realize, my friends are all looking at each other and I'm not part of the conversation anymore. They want my attention, but here I am fiddling with the wine list. So, even then, sometimes I'll just, yes, I know every wine in the list, but I'll just ask the somm to come over and say, hey, look, we're having this and this. What are your real bargains? And something would go well with that. Let them figure it out. I think that's just a great way to utilize a resource in the restaurant that is there theoretically for that purpose, but so few people understand that people think that the somm is there to intimidate you.
Once again, rely on the help at hand for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always someone around who knows more than you do. And if you can stifle your ego long enough, just ask them. Because the other thing about wine people, whether they're formally trained or not, is that they want to be, or they tend to be generous with their knowledge. Sometimes to a fault. It's like, okay, I get it, enough. All right, yeah. I asked you this 20 minutes ago and you've been talking nonstop since. So, that happens, but people are generally helpful, and restaurants are kind of screwed up because there's a lot of price gouging in restaurants, and you want to avoid that as much as you can. I think one thing that is terrible is that the wine prices create social barriers. You may be some kid from somewhere taking your girlfriend out on a date. Boy, I'm showing my age here. I apologize for that, folks. But you may be someone who's not really wine knowledgeable, taking someone else out, and you want to have a good time. And suddenly you look at these wine prices, and the cheapest bottle on the list is, $75 or something. And you don't know what to do. You don't know where to go, and it's just not fair. So you end up not having wine.
You are actually answering my next question before I ask it.
You do know I'm psychic, right?
I apparently so, yes. One of my pet peeves, I have many because I am a curmudgeon, but one of my longstanding pet peeves is about wine price gouging in restaurants. And as you know, the standard markup historically has been 250%. And the restaurant owner,
on the low side, yeah.
Well, yeah, those days are long gone. And but the rationale for the markup is always, well, we have the stemware, we have the white tablecloths, we have the sommelier, right?
Yep.
But I hit a tipping point on this about 4 years ago. We actually were in Door County and went to just a little pizza joint. The weather was very nice, and so we decided to sit outside and enjoy the weather. And so they had a little bar set up out, to serve people outside. And so since we were having pizza, I ordered a bottle of some unremarkable Italian, and it was $33. So the bartender hands me the bottle and 2 plastic cups, and thank you very much. And so we then go and sit at the picnic table.
Yep.
I looked that wine up, and it retailed for $9. The restaurant probably paid $6. Yep. Right. And they were selling that wine for $33. We're talking basically a 500% markup. And these days, 300% and 400% has become the norm. And like you say, I think that kind of pricing keeps people away from wine. My wife and I talk about often the wine is half the bill. And I just think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, I've more than once had wine be more than half the bill.
Sure.
Easily, especially if you go for second bottle.
Indeed, yes.
Then there's no question about it. As I say, wine, really should not be a barrier, because all you're doing is you're encouraging people to drink Coca-Cola. I mean, that's really the outcome of overpricing your wine.
It is.
Or they drink, some nasty beer. I don't know. But the point is, they're not going to drink wine if they can't afford it. And the problem is that restaurateurs are generally in the business because they love food, and they're cooks. They're into the food thing. Most people in restaurants, whether they're managers or wine directors, get their jobs because of their knowledge of food and wine. And the thing they don't understand is budgeting or pricing and inventory control. They don't really know that part of the world as well as they should. And so they end up, because restaurants have a very slender profit margin as it is, even in the best of circumstances. The markup on food isn't going to oftentimes pay the rent and pay the help and pay the advertising and pay to get the dumpster, emptied once a day or whatever they're doing. So they lean on the wine as a profit center, and they figure, well, no one's ever heard of Bubba Gump's Cabernet, so we'll charge $80 a bottle, even though it's costing us $15. That's great, but you can't do that. It's not sustainable. Customers will feel the squeeze. Unhappy customers really lead to a decline in the amount of covers you're doing and the amount of business you're doing. I don't think it's in anyone's best interest. The standard was, even when I was an importer and distributor, was that as a distributor, I would sell a bottle for $10 to a retailer. All right, a wine store, a liquor store. And they would take that $10 bottle and typically mark it up 50%. So it would end up being a $15 retail wine. But a restaurant would mark it up, to $30. So the thing is that the retailer got a 50% markup. The restaurant's getting a 300% markup. And it's just crazy. When you can go down the street to a store and buy an entire bottle for the price that you just paid for one glass of something on a buy the glass list, the world has gone crazy.
Exactly. And I think it is abusive. And here's the other thing. I get the argument about the profit center and, that the margins are narrow on the food. Unfortunately, not all customers are being penalized equally. It's the people who want to enjoy wine
Sure.
with their meal that are carrying the load. And I personally would prefer a restaurant to price the food more fairly, to make a profit. Obviously,
Right.
They have to do that, rather than putting the onus of breaking even on the wine.
Yeah,
drinkers.
spread the burden, equalize
right.
it to those customers that you do have, instead of putting the burden on one or two, not one or two, but on one or two segments of your customer base. Yeah,
A subset of your base, right?
Absolutely.
Right, exactly.
I agree.
Exactly. When I started WineRvana, I decided that I would have no numerical ratings or star system or any of that. And as you know, publications like the Wine Spectator, Wine Enthusiast, they have these 100-point scales that carry a lot of weight. But in fact, if you read these magazines, you won't see a wine that's under 85 points. Which really renders it a 15-point scale from 85 to 100. But the demarcation between 89 and 90 or 91, producers can charge more for a 91-point wine than they can for an 89-point wine. So they kind of love these systems. But really, it seems to me, say a 2016 Cabernet Sauvignon from a respected producer pulls a 93 score. And then the 2017 gets a 94-point score. I can't imagine what the criteria is for a 1 point difference in these numerical ratings. And the publications never share any kind of criteria for what these numbers are
Right.
being
Yeah,
based on.
they may loosely let you know what their process is, but they don't tell you anything about any of the particular wines. So it's hard to tell. And in point of fact, you're right that numerical ratings are pretty weak. I think the rating service that does the best job from a point of view of common sense is Gambero Rosso, which is the Italian rating service. And they rate things only 1, 2, or 3 glasses. That's it. Uno, dos, or tre bicchieri. And that's it. A tre bicchieri wine, a 3-glass wine, is a great wine. Now, it may be magnificent, knock your socks off wine, or it may be, wow, really good stuff. I don't know. What's the difference numerically between those two things? I don't know. And they don't either, and they don't try to figure it out. If it's a 1-glass wine, they're basically saying, hey, it's not bad, it's drinkable, got a way to go to improve, but not bad at all. If it's 2 glasses, hey, these guys are, this is a good solid wine. This is really quite enjoyable, and this is worth your shekels. And if it's a 3-glass Tre bicchieri, then boy, this is among the best of our stuff. Even though that still ranks things, it doesn't give you that numerical insanity. Yeah, is this 89.5 or 90? Well, I don't know. And as you say, the difference there, when you've got a rating panel, which they frequently do, or you've got an individual, which may be the case as well, and you're going through your notes, and again, is this an 85 and 89.5, or is it a 90? Well, if you go with the 89.5, the winery's probably going to make X dollars on it. If you go with the 90, then the winery's probably going to make, X times what? 1.25? I don't know. I mean, there's a multiple there. Right.
There is a multiple
in
there.
fact, that person may say, okay, it's a 90, and it becomes a more expensive wine. Then you and I taste the same wine, and we think, that's an 88. It's an 87. It all varies. People say, well, yeah, but so-and-so said this about the wine. And so I said, look, everybody's palate is unique. People have some broad categories, but everyone's palate is unique. And you have to understand that our olfactory epithelium, the thing we taste with, our taster in the top of our head, is wired directly into the emotional and memory portion of our brain. It's directly wired. When I taste a wine that has a little smokiness to it, I may think, at some, maybe even subconscious level, I may think, this is wonderful. What a beautiful wine this is. Because when I was a kid, I used to sit on Grandpa's lap while he smoked a cigar. And he was just the most wonderful human being. And it was such a delight for me to be able to sit up on his lap when he would relax at the end of the day. And he would tell me stories while he puffed on this big cigar. What a magnificent. So I get a little hint of that in this wine, and that just makes me feel warm and fuzzy all over. Versus my neighbor who tries the same wine, and they're immediately transported back to the time when they were 6 years old and their house burned down. And smoke has freaked them out ever since. And smoke just means fear and terror. And so this person, no matter how much they think this wine is nicely made or well made or whatever, this person is never going to feel warm and fuzzy with something that smells like smoke or tastes like smoke or is in any way, shape, or form reminiscent of smoke. Now, whose palate is right there and whose palate is wrong?
Absolutely, because we are all different. And, the famous wine critic, Robert Parker, retired 2 or 3 years ago. But his influence, and his operation goes on even though he's not active, but his influence was so profound that wine producers around the world, and particularly in Europe, some started remaking their wines to please Robert Parker. And many people bemoaned this development because that influence was so pervasive that it was causing a certain homogenization of wine in around the world, which was great if your palate was either much like or identical to Robert Parker, but if not, you were out of luck.
Parker is a very interesting figure. In assessing his influence on the wine world, we certainly have to consider the Parkerization of production, which did take place and was a very real factor, just what you discussed here. I think what Parker did that was good was his initial intent, and that was to help when there were no rating systems whatsoever, none, to help the average person understand what made a wine good or what was faulty about a wine. It also, before Parkerization became the wine world's reaction to Parker, the initial reaction to Parker was to clean up their act. It was to increase hygiene in the winery. It was to abandon traditional but cheap methods of production that yielded subpar wines. So he kind of raised the bar for everyone, but then it went crazy. Then it went too far. So then instead of people just making better wine, because let's face it, 50 years ago, you would run into faulty wines all the time. I mean, it was very common, all kinds of faults. And Parker, by putting an eye on the wine, really reduced or helped to reduce the incident of faults. Winemakers just became more careful and paid more attention, because if they got sloppy or they didn't take a step that they should take, and Parker came out and jacked them in the ratings, it could hurt their business significantly. I think there was a good side to Parker before there was a bad side. Since then, though, beyond Parker, the homogenization of wine is a bad thing, certainly. Wine factories are an economic fact of our society, and they would exist with or without Parker. And in wine factories, of course, too many decisions are made by the bean counters and not enough of them are made by the winemakers.
So I mentioned at the top of the podcast that you are the author of 50 Ways to Love Wine More. What do you think will surprise people about your book and about wine?
I think the surprise will be at just how accessible wine really is. There are so many little things you can do that will increase your knowledge of wine, that will increase your appreciation of wine, and that will increase your familiarity with wine, that you don't have to read 400-page textbook about wine. You don't have to study fermentation science to really maximize your enjoyment of wine. I think that it's more of a sitting down with a friend who's got an arm around your shoulder and is kind of leading you through the wine world, pointing out some interesting facts and features as you go along and trying some cool stuff and saying, hey, let's do this or let's do that thing. And you thinking, wow, I never even thought of that. And yeah, that's a great idea. It's just a little bit different way of looking at it. It's not quite so rigid. It's not quite so formal. And it adheres, I guess, it's driven by a phrase that's on the back cover of the book, which is that the wonder of wine resides in your heart, not in your head. And taking that as a starting point, it's really just a fun and I think very educational look at the whole world of wine, everything, history. We always look at regions and varieties and so on and so forth. There's so much more to wine. Its social utility, how we learn about it, what we can do to make the wine experience more fun and more accessible to ourselves. So it's kind of that type of thing, as I say, a friend with their arm around your shoulder saying, okay, let me share a couple of tastes with you and see what you think of these.
Well, Jim, I have thoroughly enjoyed our discussion today. Where can my listeners find out more about your work and your books?
Well, they can certainly stop by my website, which is jimlaughren.com. I guess I should spell that. It's JIMLAUGHREN.com. And then the books are available on Amazon, of course, but you can also check with your local independent bookseller if there's a local shop you'd like to support. And if you have any trouble, just send me a note, but you shouldn't have any problem. The books are all distributed in the normal spots. So as I say, check your local wine shop, and it's carried in a number of wine bars around the country as well. Take a peek and see what you think.
All right, very good. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining me today. And as usual, I will close with this quote from perhaps America's greatest philosopher, W.C. Fields. I'm reminded of my safari in Africa. Somebody forgot the corkscrew, and for several days we had to live on nothing but food and water.
This has been Wine Nirvana. To learn more, visit us at www.winervana.com.
This is a production of Habanero Media.